Hello, everyone, and I have my name is Filip Lipinski. I work at the art history department at the University, Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland, and I have a privilege to introduce and moderate our first afternoon session and introduce our distinguished speakers. Our next speaker, I have a pleasure to introduce Dr. Edyta Frelik, who is one of the co-organizers of this conference. So thank you very much again. She earned her PhD at this university, Maria Curie-Sklodowska University, in 2013 with the doctoral dissertation called Painter's Word, Thomas Hart Benton, Martin Hartley, and Ed Reinhardt as writers. And importantly, in 2003, she was the recipient of Terra Foundation for American Art International Essay Prize, which was printed in American Art Journal. The title of the essay was Reading Ed Reinhardt, I'm sorry, it was the other one, Ed Reinhardt, Painter as Writer. So, but she'll be talking about something different today. Okay, and also her essay, Reading Ed Reinhardt in Poland, appeared in the special edition of a special issue of Brooklyn Rail, a very useful source for Ed Reinhardt's fans. So please welcome Dr. Edyta Frelik.
So in a 1988 documentary about Thomas Hart Benton by Ken Burns, art critic Hilton Kramer says, "I think that Benton really missed his vocation. He should have been a writer rather than a painter. Kramer once called his paintings pure kitsch, but he thought highly of his autobiography, An Artist in America, as did novelist Sinclair Lewis, whose response to the book was, 'Here's a rare thing, a painter who can write.' The implicit suggestion in both observations is that painters, as a rule, don't handle language well, so their writings are not worthy of attention as literature. While it's not true that Benton is an exception to the rule, the untruth being that painters are rarely verbally gifted, the truth is that he was an exceptional storyteller, both in painting and in writing. And both forms of expression were equally crucial parts of Benton's self-fashioning as, to use President Harry Truman's description, the best damn painter in America, a view corroborated by the fact that he was the first artist ever to appear on the cover of Time magazine. In the 1930s, when he was universally recognized as the foremost representative of regionalism, his art was appreciated for its wholesome indigenousness, a healthy alternative to cosmopolitan and elitist modernism, especially in its abstractionist version. Ironically, at the outset of his career, Benton had successfully dabbled in abstraction, but later he turned his back on what he called the avant-garde's tiresome, meaningless aesthetic jargon. He makes his deliberate anti-elitist stance clear in his 1937 autobiography, which opens with this description of his 11-year-old son, TP. "I don't want to be a gentleman when I grow up. I want to be like my dad." Around 1922, Benton began to produce works with which he hoped to appeal to the general public by devising a down-to-earth idiom, lucid, simple, and unpretentious, one distinctly different from the styles he described as romantic and esoteric. Criticized by some for trying to wed sophistication with folksiness, or blend, as John Kennedy put it, El Greco and Huck Finn, his paintings were praised by those who, like Louis Mumford, saw them as Benton's genuine contribution to Americana. His style reached its fullest expression in his flagship genre, the mural. intended to be viewed in public places rather than in museums or art galleries, though the artist somewhat perversely envisioned them best displayed in, quote, whorehouses and saloons where normal people would see them, end of quote. His murals quickly earned him the status of one of America's favorite artists, one sensitive to the aesthetic sensibilities of the common man. For Benton himself, the chief advantage of the mural was its grand scale, which offered better narrative possibilities than any other painterly formats. And telling stories was the main thing he wanted to do through his painting. Pointing out that abstract painters being just interested in pure expressing yourself often resulted in a kind of bitter emptiness, which in his view was, quote, the emptiness of a person looking into himself all the time. But the objective world, he went on to say, is always rich. There's always something round the next bend of the river, end of quote. Justifying his rejection of modern art, Benton reveals here his concept of picturing, which combines that which is temporal by nature, by definition, with that which is spatial by nature. It seems almost natural to assume that his murals were visual realizations of prior perceptions and thoughts, which he first had to articulate, if only for himself, in verbal language in order to organize them into narrative sequences. However, I want to suggest a different kind of relation between his pictorial narratives and the verbal ones he produced, so to speak, with his left hand. I believe that, in fact, the idiosyncratic style of Benton's autobiographical writings was largely derived from his paintings and not the other way around. When he wrote An Artist in America, he was already a mature painter who regularly tackled formal and compositional challenges in large format works. Although the smooth flow of his murals seems to suggest that he was a natural-born storyteller, the look of the natural is an effect he accomplished through calculated and meticulous planning. Behind the stories he tells in his book, one can identify various verbal tactics which, though medium-specific, are close analogues of the painterly solutions he successfully employed in his panoramic Mosaics of America. While in his autobiography he projects himself as a Midwestern bumpkin, Benton was instead an experienced and sophisticated craftsman, fully in control of his medium. His sophistication, in fact his modernism, is revealed in those places where he deliberately exposes the stitches and hooks that hold words, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs together, as though he wanted to remind the reader that, like paint, words are material that has to be handled with deliberation and dexterity. Benton described his technique of composing murals as, quote, the amalgamation of many subjects having little or no pictorial relationship to one another in such a way that they would function as parts of an overall pictorial form, end of quote. Striving to create the impression that the nature of American life unrolled in front of the viewer's eyes, he took advantage of the panoptical character of murals painted on all four walls of a room. And one way to look at a multi-part mural like that is to stand in the middle of the space enveloped by the panorama. But it's practically impossible to absorb the view by continuous horizontal panning in either direction, as the eye will always want to follow a particular narrative line that captivates it. Viewing a four-wall mural is somewhat similar to reading a book, which cannot be grasped all at once. It must be taken in sentence after sentence, scene after scene, one story at a time. Benton achieves narrative congruity in both media by piecing together in a non-linear fashion the work's various sub-narratives, folk legends, myths, tall tales, proverbial anecdotes, vignettes, jokes, and simple reminiscences of past days. In paintings, for instance, in this work from 1934, which was inspired by a classic murder ballad, he doesn't retell a familiar story, but paints the telling of it. In his book, the equivalent of that is frame narrative, a literary device otherwise known as a story within a story. His frame tales are told in many different voices and registers. Benton often quotes verbatim words spoken by the characters he describes, which he recorded during his travels using his own transcription system, and here's a sample of that. Demonstrating remarkable attentiveness to the idiosyncrasies of people's speech, he frequently lets his characters display their identity not only by their appearance and manner, but also by the distinctive features of their inflection and phrasing. They droll, whisper, purr, cry, yell, or shout, as do the loud-mouthed Bible bashers. He mostly narrates the stories himself, but occasionally surrenders his authority as the principal storyteller to others. The absence of a clearly marked hierarchy of subplots, themes, voices, or points of view is typical of both Benton's painting and writing. His pictorial and verbal narratives are analogous examples of locking the different subjects together for the purpose of staging the simple spectacle of American life. Equally typical is the implied lack of closure, as when Benton says, "This is not all I have found in the hills. I can go on indefinitely from one story to another. So many things have happened in my tracks there," and so on and so on. I made this much shorter. Benton's contemporaries criticized this type of narrative open-endedness in his murals as they did their apparent structurelessness. They saw chaos and confusion in his panoramas instead of an ordered sequence of events. Benton's overcrowded panels were for some a source of visual fatigue. For instance, Georgia O'Keeffe complained, "Just thinking about them makes me tired." Perhaps what made viewers like O'Keeffe uncomfortable was that he refused to observe conventions of classic realistic painting, which is predicated on the power of the center. Betraying the principle of compositional hierarchy, Benton dispenses with separating foreground and background by proportional scaling of subjects. In his murals, relative proportions are arbitrarily altered, the impression being that people, objects, and elements of landscape encroach on one another. Distorting perspectives, he creates dynamic configurations, defying the laws of conventional visual grammar, which is one of the reasons why his murals were seen as lacking in coherence and harmony. But, as Matthew Beigel observes in his study of Benton, the painter's designs, however unconventional, are very precisely structured. For instance, in America Today, quote, "One can clearly see a composition of underlying diagonals, X patterns, related verticals and horizontals, and fulcrums around which pivot associated shapes," end of quote. The most distinctive result of that is the push and pull effect produced by the alternating convexities and concavities, Benton's famous bumps and hollows, whose rhythmic throbbing is perceived by the eyes as a pulsating sensation. This rhythmic structure is punctuated by what Benton called vertical posts, perpendicular, mostly architectonic elements appearing at regular intervals, which not only bind the mural's numerous self-contained segments into a continuous unfolding panoramic whole, but as Beigel notes, provide moments of stability and points of rest, and I hope everybody can see those points. Interweaving and integrating motion and stasis is also Benton's method of driving the narrative in his autobiography. And perhaps the best example of that is the description of his steam turbine towboat trip on the Mississippi from Cincinnati Landing in Illinois to New Orleans. The leisurely flow of the narrative, metaphorically emulating the slow movement of the boat down the lazy river, is regularly brought to a halt when Benton, chewing on his tobacco and sitting on the deck after a debauch of food, inserts all sorts of digressions. Most of the time, however, the sluggish trip continues, marked by inactivity in slow motion. Perceptual relativity is suggestively conveyed by Benton's thoughtful choice of adjectives and adverbs which slow down motion, as in the description of the riverbank moving past the boat, which, because it's going downstream, seems stationary. In the slow-moving description, vertical posts, such as church spires or wisps of smoke going up the sky, break the horizontal monotony, coming into view and then drifting out of the picture the way the equivalents in Benton's murals do as the spectator moves his eyes across the wall-to-wall panels. From time to time, the almost lethargic dullness of the pictorial come and go is abruptly interrupted, as in this passage. The head of the tow was hit suddenly by an oblique rush of water. A cable up front snapped like a cannon shot and was whipped up against the side of an empty barge with drum-like reverberations. Through a succession of action words, very short, mostly verbs and nouns, hit, rush, snapped, cannon shot, whipped, drum, reverberations, and then swing, shaking, banging, engines, rapidly maneuvering, Benton instantly reinvigorates his narration only to slow down the pulse and return to its normal pace again as the pilot gets his barges back in line. That the sensation of motion can be induced by words, just as it can be triggered by images, even when completely still, as in Opart, is illustrated by another passage in which Benton describes an old abandoned steamboat, quote, on the Ohio in a mud flat on the Kentucky side, lying crazily up against the shore, end of quote. Interweaving short and long sentences and lively descriptions with nostalgic musings, the narrative progresses in an undulating fashion with varying intensities of sensual perceptions. Even matter-of-fact informational content is rendered in a way that makes words and images move in front of the reader's eyes harmoniously, in unison. As long stretches of green roll by at the pace measured by the river's lazy flow, intrusions of dynamic words and agitated scenes continue to stir the waters and animate the narrative, providing rhythmic variety of the sort the viewer experiences while studying the artist's murals. The palette of compositional stratagems Benton employs also includes the technique of meta-narration. In his autobiography, he interjects self-referential remarks, exposing fictional illusion by reminding the reader that reading a story involves handling an artifact, which quite literally is a record of the creative, intellectual act of writing. Producing this written record is akin to the act of painting in that it leaves behind a material object in which thoughts are transformed into text via the physical manipulation of ink and paper. Sentences such as, "The old second mate I mentioned a few pages back," function as self-reflexive allusions to the materiality of the printed medium Benton used to convey the story of his life. Similarly, Benton's murals and pictures are filled with visual reference to various media associated with storytelling, including countless examples of musicians playing songs, journalists taking notes in longhand or typing articles, people reading newspapers and books, orators delivering speeches, filmmakers shooting movies and viewers watching them, inscriptions, signs, notices, and other textual elements displayed in public places, and framed paintings and posters hanging in rooms, halls, and saloons. These references add dynamism to the narrative pulse by hinting at the metafictional and performative character of the text and image-mediated transaction between the artist and his audience. As in a presentational theater, Benton doesn't allow his viewers and readers to forget that the truth of storytelling resides both in the story and in the telling of it. Starting with minimal building blocks, patterns of words, as he referred to them, Benton tries to render in language such signature characteristics of his muralist style as multi-layeredness, directness, dynamism, and vibrance, all of which he translates into the vernacular. The constructedness of his narrative can best be seen in those places in the text which are related to the painter's experience of working on a mural. His reflections on how images are arranged over a large surface almost imperceptibly metamorphose into a conglomerate of styles, literary traditions and motifs kept together by visible seams in a large textual patchwork. Making his language express, quote, the ordinary straight recognition of things as they were and are, and keeping it free from the manners and prejudices of the high-toned, unquote, Benton can be candidly explicit regardless of topic. Perhaps most exemplary of his style are his short descriptions of people, often contained in humorous one-liners, such as what sounds like a line from a country tune, Tex had a split lip and a wife. The folksy, by the way, brisk portrayals of various characters activate the mind's visual faculty. Relying on his painterly sensibility, Benton demonstrates his excellent selective skills. By focusing upon a single but well-chosen characteristic, he economically and effectively draws a suggestive image with just a few word strokes. Instantly visible to the eye. They are thus analogues of figures painted with a few quick evocative movements of the brush. The concise, vigorous sentences that Benton uses facilitate the flow of his narrative, which, unobstructed by linguistic ambiguities or verbosity, dynamically moves the action forward. Kramer aptly described Benton's sentences as short and tough, every one of them really like a kind of bull's eye. The artist's systematic application of minimal but perfectly meaningful combinations of words results in an engaging momentum. It is his way of avoiding the cultivated affectations and borrowed manners that he associated with Stieglitz, who, Benton remembered, never talked directly to the point, but wove a web of discourse over, under, and around a subject. One of Stieglitz's actual conversational sentences would, Faulkner-like, run to 2 or 3 pages of print. Proud to be an inveterate and anti-modernist and all-American rough and ready son of a bitch, who provocatively chose a representational style many of his critics dismissed as simple art for simple people, Benton demonstrated that such simplicity resulted from an elaborate, even sophisticated craftsmanship, which he pressed into the service of telling a good story. This narrative impulse is why, in his case, painting and writing seem in so many ways auxiliary creative outlets. Whether depicting invented imagery or remembered autobiographical sketches, he doesn't assume that rendering visual images via words is simply an automatic process of translating one language into another. Endowed with a natural storyteller's instinct and talent, he was particularly well equipped to become the chief exponent of the American scene. But his modernist background left him with an indelible artistic self-awareness apparent in the way he constructs images from words, demonstrating a verbal mastery comparable to his mastery of pictorial means. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and we have our last speaker at this panel. It will be ZUZANA TABAČKOVÁ. She graduated from the Department of English and American Studies at the Faculty of Art at Konstantin the Philosopher University in Nitra in Slovakia. That was in 2005. In 2007, she graduated from the Department of Political Science, where she specialized in Middle East studies and Arabic language. And as we'll see from the topic, there is this connection. And she got her PhD in Translation Studies at the Faculty of Arts at the same university in Nitra. Currently, she works at the Department of Language and Pedagogy and Intercultural Studies. So the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So my presentation today on Gibran, Khalil Gibran, was inspired by a new translation of a collection of Gibran's works, which was published in Slovakia a couple of years ago. And the translation itself was not bad. Gibran's works were translated by the Slovak national poet and a translator, Milan Richter, who was awarded the first prize for the translation of poetry for his translation of Gibran's works. The book itself looked very attractive, colorful pages, expensive paper, but still there was something disturbing about the book. The fact was that Gibran's original illustrations and paintings were replaced in the Slovak publishing or in the Slovak translation with pictures from 1000 Nights, with pictures from Islamic culture of mosques, and this was a demonstration of certain cultural stereotypes that we tend to have when we look at an Arab culture. This made me decide to discuss two distinct faces of Gibran, Khalil Gibran, in my presentation today. And the first face, as we know, is quite well known. It's the face of a writer, a literary figure, the author of The Prophet, which was published in 1923 and which until now, according to the statistics, has sold more than 10 million copies in America alone, which has been translated to 20 languages. So this face, the literary face of Gibran, Khalil Gibran, is quite well known. However, his second face, the face of an artist, is not that well known. It's the face of an artist who left behind more than 400 works, paintings, sketches, portraits in pencil, in oil, in watercolor, that are now scattered all across the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. What I want to argue today, or to stress today, is that Gibran's second face was somehow suppressed by his literary fame. However, Gibran established a complementary relationship between his first face and his second face, or in other words, between his literary representations or literary visions and his artistic representation. So when I was thinking of how to order the presentation today, the thing which came into my mind and which I think of all the time when I think of Gibran is the idea of in-betweenness, because Khalil Gibran was always in between two cultures. One of his biographers, Najjar, argues that Gibran has always straddled both sides of the fence, one foot in the East and one foot in the West. And in the same way as we can view Gibran as a person with one foot in the East and one foot in the West, when we look at his literary face, we can see that he has one foot in prose and one foot in poetry. And when we look at his work as a complex whole, we can see that he has one foot in literature and the other, less known foot is connected with art. So I will first look at his in-betweenness two cultures. Why I call this sojourning? The first generation of Arab American writers are often called immigrants. And I would like to argue today that the term which is used is not quite correct, because when they came to America, they didn't come there to immigrate, to stay there the whole life. The first generation of Arab American writers was a generation which viewed the United States as what they called in Arabic, Baladul Khayarat. Baladul Khayarat, it translates as the land of the wealth or country of the wealth. So they intended to go to America and then come back, earn money and come back. That's why a more proper term would be called for them sojourners, because they were sojourning all the time between their eastern homeland and their adopting American country. So we can, in Gibran's life, we can identify several moments which are intercultural or which defined his in-betweenness to cultures. The first one was his mother country, which was Lebanon, a country in between 3 continents, 3 religions, including 18 different religious confessions and a myriad of different kinds of cultures. This made John Paul II in 1997 proclaim that Lebanon is more than a country. Lebanon is a message. Another thing, a statement which is inscribed on Gibran's statue in Beirut says, if Lebanon had not been my native country, I would have chosen it to be. For me, when speaking about Gibran, another moment which was decisive for his future life was the year 1895, when he with his family came to the United States. And this was the first time that he somehow began to be aware of his otherness. This idea made him change his name from Khalil to Khalil. One of the interpretations says that his teacher at the local school in Queens in Boston suggested that his name and his artistic works would be more interested if he skipped or somehow, eliminated or skipped his name after his paternal grandfather, and if he changed the spelling of his name. Another moment was the meeting with Fred Hollanday, who was a very influential figure in artistic circles at the time, and who viewed Gibran as some kind of an Eastern prophet, Eastern boy, who served as a model for Fred Holland's paintings, in fact, and he also was the one who introduced Gibran to artistic circles in the United States. And ever since then, Gibran was somehow moving in between Lebanon, USA, Paris, USA, and so on. This made him a symbol. He's often called the bridge between the East and the West, transcending cultural differences, a musician who sings of tolerance, unity, and global understanding. In the same way as he transcends East and West, some literary critics, as Hassan, for example, view him as, or view his both literary and artistic attempts as attempts to unify the best facets of the Western world with those of the Eastern world. This was somehow also transferred, this in-betweenness was also transferred to his literary phase. So first I will concentrate on the literary phase of Gibran, Khalil Gibran, which stands with one foot in poetry and one foot in prose. Well, a legend has it that a long, long time ago, poetry dwelt on the ancient Mount of Parnassus, while prose lived closer to human dwellings. In Gibran's work, both of these sisters are somehow connected. Also, Ursula Le Guin states that poetry is the beautiful dumb blonde, all words, and prose is the small, smart brunette with glasses, all ideas. If we could take this into account, we could say that Gibran's works are both blonde and brunette in a way. This is one of the prose poems, which is called On Beauty. It's kind of well known. I'm not going to read the whole thing, we can just look at the end. But you are life and you are the veil. Beauty is eternity gazing at itself in a mirror. But you are eternity and you are the mirror. So what makes his text prosaic and what makes his text poetic? So first, the texts have, the page layout reminds us usually of prose. Usually there are epic parts and prosaic parts, then the sentence-like form. But when we start to read Gibran's texts, we find out that they are in fact chains of pictures, chains of metaphors based on a specific rhythm which stems from parallelism, repetitions, constant images, specific type of dictions, which is based on so-called what folks views as value words, such as beauty, love, which, according to folks, form the system of human values, and chains of metaphors or metaphorical language. Why was this first generation of Arab American writers so interested in the idea of prose poetry? It had its roots in Arabic literature, which for a long time Arabic poetry had to always follow certain canon. The most typical genre was so-called qasida, a typical Arabic poem, which had strict linguistic rules, which used traditional poetic meters, which had to be followed. Specific type of rhythms, always the same structure, which had to be followed. Rigorous composition rules. And these rules created some kind of a poetic canon, and if the writer, if the poet didn't follow this canon, his poetry was somehow denied or refused. That's why the first generation of Arab American writers who came to the United States, they were really impressed by the idea of the free romantic spirit. There is a question why, because the first American writers, Arab American writers, they came to America at a time when it was the beginning of modernism or even realism, and they were more attracted toward romanticism. And Iman Gulieva gives us an explanation, I'm quoting, Arab emigre writers found themselves closer to the chronologically more distant romanticism. Social and artistic thought in their homeland was not yet ready to realism. So they took prose poem as an ideal form which they followed. And in case of Gibran, this romantic thought or his romantic subjects, from the point of form and from the point of view of content, were also transferred to his paintings. So I'm going to compare them now. So first I'm going to focus on the subjects. All the paintings, sketches and pictures that you see have been or were made by Gibran himself. So one of the most important motives that we can find in Gibran's work is the search for beauty and harmony in the world, such as Harmony at the Peak. It's also the title that he gave to his famous painting. And it's suggested also in the lines that I have already quoted, beauty is eternity gazing at itself in a mirror, but you are eternity and you are a mirror. One of the even more important ideas which have their place in Gibran's artistic and literary output was his exclusive interest in the self, in the individual, who is viewed usually at the center of the universe. Also the idea of the unity of man, God and nature is stressed. Gibran was very fond by the idea of transcendentalism, especially he was a profound reader of Emerson's Nature, so this was also transferred somehow to his poems as well. So all things in this vast universe exist in you, with you and for you. And the idea is suggested also by maybe one of his most famous paintings, The Divine World. Then another motive is the motive of freedom, freedom of the individual, but also freedom to express himself. In his works, Gibran often criticized the Maronite church of his homeland, the oppression of women, for example. Sometimes he's discussed even in the discourse of feminism. This was also suggested in, this is a line from the Prophet, from the prose poem On Freedom, which says, "And how shall you rise beyond your days and nights, unless you break the chains which you at the dawn of your understanding have fastened around your noon hour." Another idea is the idea of self-perfection of the individual in finding the true self, such as only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing, and when you have reached the mountaintop, then you shall begin to climb, and when the earth shall claim your limbs, then shall you truly dance. Usually self-perfection or this idea of self-perfection comes from the inner side of the individual. Then, of course, another point or another motive which can be traced both in his literary and artistic works is the idea of God present in nature. Rather look about you and you shall see him playing with your children, and look into space, you shall see him walking in a cloud, outstretching his arms in the lightning and descending in rain. You shall see him smiling in flowers, then rising and waving his hands in trees. Last but not least is the idea of intuition, intuitive understanding, the idea of instincts, man as the source who has the capability to change things and to find true knowledge. Keep me away from the wisdom which does not cry, the philosophy which does not laugh, and the greatness which does not bow before children. If we look at his works from the point of view of form, we can find many parallels. Gibran often uses or relies on very simple and, as I said, value words. His paintings are regarded simple in the meaning that they show usually man in his nudity, or naked man, just man, as it is sometimes referred to. Then, while in his writing, he often relies on repetitions and parallelism. Also, his paintings were often criticized for relying on recurring images. For example, one of his most well-known critics, Anne Case, she criticized Gibran for his paintings. She said that one of his paintings always suggests the other one, which, by the way, Gibran took as a compliment, and he said that I always wanted to become an artist who awakens new visions in the observer. Then, displaying universal truths, not bound to time and place, connected to what Ezra Pound used or said about literature, that literature is news that stays news. In his paintings, you cannot find any worldliness, any man-made things. Usually the figures are just floating in undefined setting, I would say, in the clothes or in somewhere in mid-air, so they cannot be put or set to a certain time and place. Then unity of man and nature. Usually Gibran would use very soft, muted, blurred outlines which would connect, or which would make it seem that a man in the picture, in the painting, is a part of a larger surrounding. Then focus on the inner self. Usually Gibran's figures in paintings would have closed eyes, which was very, very, very typical for his faces. The idea of the romantic free spirit, so figures are usually floating in the sky, free of material bounds. So just to conclude, Gibran was always fond of faces, different kind of faces. As I said, he even had two faces. I'm going to quote from his poem Faces, which was published as a part of Madman, one of his English language works. So, I have seen a face with 1,000 countenances, and a face that was but a single countenance, as if held in a mold. I have seen a face whose sheen I could look through to the ugliness beneath, and a face whose sheen I had to lift to see how beautiful it was. I have seen an old face, much lined with nothing, and a smooth face in which all things were graven. I know faces because I look through the fabric my own eye weaves to behold the reality beneath. Just to address, or my final remark would be that even in the same way as Khalil Gibran had this well-known literary face and less well-known artistic face, we as recipients should view Gibran as a whole we should view both of his faces. So we should be both readers and observers of his work, or readers of his written work and readers of his artistic output. We tend to be very often somehow, or books about Gibran is an ambiguous figure. His reception is not kind of straightforward, because when I looked at the American anthologies, I could find, maybe I'm mistaken, but I could find just one anthology which included Gibran among American writers. It was from the Anthology of American Writers series, and the part about Gibran was written by Bach. And in the same way, when I looked at the Arabic side of the problem, Arabic literary critics tend to see Gibran's work as juvenile literature, literature for teenage people or teenagers and maybe in a way also children. His artistic works began to receive more attention in the United States in recent years. In Savannah there was a big exhibition of his works a couple of years ago. However, in the Middle East, his artistic works are almost unknown. There is a museum in Psheri, which is his native village, but it's quite far from Beirut, so his work somehow remains isolated in a way. Just to conclude, he or we should, when we look at Gibran, Khalil Gibran, we are tempted to look at him as an Arab writer, but this view is often subject to stereotypes. To come back to the example I gave you at the beginning about the book which was published in Slovakia, when I saw the pictures of the mosques, I asked myself why mosques. Khalil Gibran was not even a Muslim, he was a Lebanese Christian. When I saw the pictures from 1000 Nights, I asked why. He didn't even, what the literary critics usually tend to criticize about Gibran is that he was not truly a cultural translator, that he was not somehow displaying his, the culture of his homeland in his works. He made them very universal. So I asked myself, why 1000 Nights? So just from the point of recipients should work or should look at Gibran from this bridge between two cultures and not be subject, I would say, by cultural stereotypes. And thank you.
Thank you very much for this lucid presentation and keeping it within 20 minutes.
Thomas Hart Benton famously published 2 autobiographies. What was his motivation for publishing a second one?
Well, the second one, called An American in Art, published later, I can't recall the exact year, was devoted more to his painting techniques and introduced those interested in how an artist works on a mural into the secrets of that trade. So it's different from an artist in America in that it's not a regular autobiography, although again it is chronological, and there are of course references to his life, and as he describes how he worked on different commissions, on different murals. But it's he called it a technical autobiography. And there is a third one, which I don't know if you can call an autobiography, and thank you to Erika Doss who told me about it. An intimate story, which is an early version, which is in fact a description of his early career, of his beginnings as an artist, of his Paris period in life. And so he was really prolific, as you can see, because we can say that he authored 3 autobiographies if we treat the first one as a full autobiography. It wasn't published, as far as I know. There are big extracts in Henry Adams's book on Benton.
Thank you. I have a question for ZUZANA. Thanks for telling us about Gibran's art. I recall in the 70s, so many people buying The Prophet and looking at the art specifically and never really reading the book. So I've always been fascinated with those sort of drippy, romantic paintings, which I never knew he had done. I just remember people looking at them, and it was sort of like Cat Stevens art, you know. And my question is, he went to the United States. Did he study with Day? Who did he study with? Where are those 400 paintings? And is there a Gibran art museum? Is there a market for his work? Are there, you know, and during him, this is kind of a long question, but during his lifetime, was he known for being an artist? Did he market his art? Were there calendars made? You know, what was his success with the art?
Okay, he first, as I mentioned, Fred Hollanday was the one who, because Gibran, when he came to America, he started to attend artistic school. One of the interpretation was that his teacher at the local school at Quincy, she saw that he was somehow talented and she wanted to support it. And she was also the one who introduced Gibran to Fred Hollanday. In case of Fred Hollanday, I just mentioned the fact that he took Gibran as his model for these oriental images, but in fact he also introduced him to the artistic circles. In case of formal education in the area of art, Gibran received some during his years in Beirut and in Paris, but that's because of the influence. That's interesting that he was from a more or less conservative family, and his mother and his half or step brother, they were a little bit concerned about Gibran's contact with Fred Hollanday. So they sent him back to Beirut. So Gibran studied there for 2 years at the Madrasat al-Hikmah, which translates as the School of Wisdom. So he studied there traditional Arabic literature, culture, and art. But art was just still one of his hobbies. And then when he came back to America, I think that his relationship with Mary Haskell is kind of well known. So Mary Haskell, she was his lifelong friend. He even proposed to her, but she refused to marry him. And she was an influential figure, a headmistress of a local school, and kind of a well-off lady who supported Gibran financially. So she decided to send him to Paris, where Gibran spent 2 years in 2 different kinds of schools. That was like a part of his formal education. During his life, he had a couple of exhibitions, artistic exhibitions. The problem is that one of his first works, they were destroyed. There was a fire and it destroyed his artworks, which later Gibran referred to as a success because he didn't like them later on. So he said that it was okay, that the fire just destroyed them. Then Fred Hollanday in 1903, he organized the first exhibition of Gibran's works, and then a year later there were 2, one in, I think it was January, and it was organized by, I don't remember by who, but a month later Mary Haskell organized another exhibition. And as far as today, what I said, the problem is that his works are really scattered all over the world. One of the biggest museums of Gibran's art, it's in Bashari. Bashari is his native village where he was born. It's in the northern part of Lebanon, and they say that the museum is in Gibran's house where he was born, but it's not true. They just decided to put it in the house in the central part of the village. There are a couple of museums which have or which contain Gibran's works, and the one I've mentioned, I think it's Telfer. I hope my pronunciation is okay. Telfer Museum in Savannah, and they organized a really big exhibition of his works a couple of years ago. I don't remember the year exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Speakers again, maybe, and coffee break.